there's a quite, I think, wonderful introductory piece here by Edward Mortimer and Shibli Mallot, which talks about what they call the Arab exception. In other words, why is it that this is a region for so many decades, that for so many decades was immune to regime change, was immune to the winds of democratization that swept Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia and East Asia and parts of East Asia, parts of Africa, Latin America, and so on. Why did the Arab world not change in the same way that other regions did? And they very rightly dismiss some of the shallow and borderline racist cultural explanations having to do with Islam. In fact, most Muslims are not in the Middle East or the Arab world, and most of them live in democratic countries. So that's obviously not the case, not the issue. And they focus on something that I think is actually probably, if not the most important factor, and they argue it is the most important factor, it's one of the most important factors, which is that this is a region in which oil and in which regimes which derive rent from oil and which are absolute, I call them, they're absolute autocracies of a pre-Magna Carta level. In other words, absolute sovereigns with absolute power to do absolutely anything they want and absolutely unlimited resources have dominated the Arab world. So given this peculiar condition of the Arab world, of oil autocracies, how can we expect civil resistance to overcome this?
Well, the essential feature of an oily regime is that it doesn't need the population to pay taxes, certainly not on any significant scale. One or two countries in the region are beginning to introduce taxes in cases where they didn't have them before, including, I believe, even certain moves in Saudi Arabia. But basically, you have a system where the governments don't depend on the population for anything much except a certain amount of passive obedience, which can be assisted by substantial payouts of one kind or another. So it's easy takings for an oily regime. And I have no simple recipe for how to change that, other than I do think it's the case that where you've got a regime that has such dominant power in a society, the way in which you may be able to gain access to some of that power is if the armed forces are neutral or take the side of the demonstrators. And of course that was part of the story in Egypt, not that Egypt is an oily state
and
particularly. And Tunisia.
You're right.
But where a state has not just oil, but also an army which is totally beholden to the government, I think it's extremely difficult. And I'm not in favor of universalism. I don't believe that one can come up with universal answers. And one of the problems I have to be frank about it, both with some forms of American advocacy of democracy and some forms of American support for democratic revolutions by nonviolent means, is precisely you do have to think about circumstances, the culture, the interests of different groups in society, and they do vary.